Welcome to Dial P for Procurement, a show focused on today's biggest spend, supplier, and contract management related business opportunities. Dial P investigates the nuanced and constantly evolving boundary of the procurement supply chain divide with a broad cast of engaged executives, providers, and thought leaders. Give us an hour and we'll provide you with a new perspective on supply chain value. And now it's time to Dial P for Procurement.
Hi there, I'm Kelly Barner, your host for Dial P for Procurement here on Supply Chain Now, and welcome to my monthly video interview. Now I'm joined by a very familiar face, at least a very familiar face to me, and we were joking before starting to record that these end up being weird interviews because we spend so much time discussing these things offline. But I'm thrilled to be joined by my partner at Art of Procurement, Philip Ideson, for what is, I think, going to be a very interesting conversation. So, hi, Phil. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Kelly, my pleasure. Thank you. And as we were saying beforehand, it's always a little bit different being the interviewee versus the interviewer. So it's going to be an interesting one. I'm under the spotlight this time.
Under the spotlight, and yet we're kind of flipping things. So people know the two of us for advocating for procurement, helping people imagine the art of the possible, covering some supply chain issues. But today we're going to talk about a news story that gives us an opportunity to look at things from the supplier perspective and maybe advocate some solutions to the challenges that everyone is seeing, but really keeping that supplier experience and perspective in mind. Now, before we get to that, for anybody that hasn't met you, I want to give them a little bit more of a chance to know about your background. So you've worked as a procurement practitioner in the past. Can you talk a little bit about where your experience is there?
Yeah, and I was thinking beforehand, I've got 22 years in procurement, and it seems like it's so quick that you keep adding a number to that. And of that 22 years, I think about 12 years was a practitioner, 10 years has been as a consultant, an advisor, running the art of procurement, doing a bunch of other things. But that 12-year of practitioner experience really actually started, I did an internship with GM where I was in material control. So I did a material control internship there, and that led me to go to Ford Motor Company when I graduated. So I graduated through the Ford scheme in the direct materials perspective. And so I started my procurement career in direct materials, and I probably spent half of it in the direct space and half of it on the indirect side, across sourcing, category management, transformation, supplier risk management, running a captive shared service center, up to a head of international procurement. So I kind of always deliberately tried to check a lot of different boxes. And then from an industry perspective, auto, pharma, CPG, financial services, those were kind of my practitioner days. And then as a consultant and a provider, touched a bunch of other industries aside from that.
Now, one of the points that you made, and I actually want to pause and clarify this because I know the terminology can be different, but this is going to be really important to our conversation today. You talked about the fact that you were in direct materials.
Yeah.
So when we talk about direct versus indirect, and I know I grew up in retail, we called indirect not for resale. So when we're talking about direct materials in any company or industry, we're talking about the product or the service or the technology that's being resold for profit, right?
Yeah, or any of the components or pieces that go into that product. Different companies, different industries may define the direct and the indirect side slightly different, but the general rule of thumb, the direct is things that are going into that product that's resold. Indirect is everything else, essentially.
And so before we get into the story we're going to talk about today, there's one more thing I want to get your read from, because again, I think this is material. We're now over 2 years into this business about the pandemic. We're almost 2 years into every single headline being either supply chain crisis or supply chain disruption. What would you say is the general tone of the conversations that you're having, of the attitude that you see evidenced through social media posts? Where do you think people's minds are dealing with the economic conditions right now?
Yeah, I think that, one of the words that comes to mind is fatigue. I think folks are fatigued with everything that's going on and the unknown, especially as a procurement professional where you're judged in a lot of organizations on either or both these things, the ability to make sure that the company has the right product or service at the right place at the right time, at the right cost. And right now we're struggling with right place, the right time, and the right cost, through factors that in a lot of cases are kind of beyond a procurement professional's control, but procurement is really trying to manage. But then when you look at your self-worth as a procurement professional, if you've always judged it on things running smoothly and saving money, which a lot of procurement professionals do, then it's been quite a beating, the last couple of years on both those fronts. So I think there's fatigue. Yeah. There's still the unknown. But, we've talked about for a long time about the unknown being the new normal. Yeah. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And then I see a lot of individuals, but also that rolls up to organizations based on our leadership, seeing this as a huge opportunity. So actually, is this an opportunity for procurement to step up and show a greater value proposition to their organization? And those that have embraced that, I think, are really, are really doing well in their organizations in repositioning the role of procurement.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting. I used to have this good friend that would talk about when things get stressful, she would say, we all have a dance or a set of behaviors that we fall back on. And procurement has worked for a long time, truthfully, to get away from being cost-driven, to get away from bullying suppliers. But as the fatigue grows, as the pressure mounts, we're starting to see, I think, maybe evidence that a few companies are falling back to that dance or instinctive set of defensive behaviors. Mm-hmm. And a recent example of that was covered in a news story. The news story happens to mention Target and Walmart specifically, but there are many other companies dealing with this, especially in retail. And it talked about the fact that between inventory disruptions and just plain far too much inventory on hand, they're starting to respond to the stress and the cash flow pressures by mounting what they expect of their suppliers. And so there were a few things about this particular story that were interesting. One is that the suppliers were named and quoted as complaining about these large retailers that they're working with. That's pretty unprecedented. But we also have some words from the retailers about how they view how they're dealing with this with regards to suppliers. So even some of the suppliers that were concerned about having empty shelves, we know Walmart and Target both chartered their own ocean freight in order to get inventory here from China. They were concerned about seasonality and empty shelves. Now they have the opposite problem. Target in particular has $15.1 billion worth of inventory that they wish they did not have. And unfortunately, as a result, their net profit margin is down by almost 50% year over year. Now, add to that the fact that consumer demand preferences continue to be fickle. People went from spending on home improvement to spending on trips and experiences and restaurants. And you have a very complicated situation where they're turning to suppliers and saying, here is our expectation of what we want you to do in terms of handling this. And those suppliers are not happy. So before we get into the details, any initial thoughts or perspectives based on what you've heard, what you've read about the situation that these retailers find themselves in?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that, Target and Walmart, and really our discussion goes, it's really more on retail as opposed to focusing on those specific companies. But they were kind of between a rock and a hard place because you have, chronic shortages. So the natural reaction to chronic shortages is to invest in inventory. Yeah. You're investing in inventory then going into a possible recession where demand softens. But if they hadn't done that, I mean, they were investing in their own brands to be the place where people know they can get the things they need when they want them. Yeah. And so, they took the call to invest in this inventory because they wanted to make sure that the shelves are fully stocked, because if they weren't, then that's going to have a big brand hit from them as well. We went to Target and there was nothing on the shelves. Or we went to Walmart, there's nothing on the shelves. So you can certainly see why they made the decisions that they made, and no one really had perfect information. Then the question is, okay, once you're in that situation, what do you do about it? So now they're obviously trying to mitigate the the impact of buying the inventory into a softening market. But I mean, we're going to see this play out everywhere. We've talked about chips for the last 2 years.
That's right.
So for the last, I don't know, 3-4 months, we've been talking about, with some of the guests on Art of Procurement around, well, chips, now we're investing in all this capacity. We're going to build over capacity going into a weakening market. We're going to have the same problem. The prices are going to sink. We're going to get deflation rather than inflation.
Yeah.
And this is kind of the cycle that's going to play out the next couple of years. So we're probably going to see that in these situations with retail as well. Absolutely.
And in the short term, what we're hearing from the suppliers, at least, is that retailers are saying, hold on to that inventory for us. I know we said we wanted it, but we're not ready for it just yet. They're saying, instead of us coming and picking that up from your warehouse in China, how about you pay to ship the inventory to a warehouse in the US, and then we'll get it from you when we're ready? Or simply, and this is an oldie but a goodie, payment terms being extended, people just not paying on the agreed upon schedule for the things that they've ordered. And in this particular article, there's one quote that I wanted to share, and I double checked this. This is a real company. The company is called Exploding Kittens. They make card games. And their chief executive officer has said, we're having to hold back some orders in China. We now have stock in China that Target does not need. So we are shifting that stuff to the United States and have to use our own freight, ultimately eating into margins. And that's from Carly McGinnis, who is the president of Exploding Kittens. Now, there are a couple of things that are particularly interesting about this situation. We've talked about the difference between direct and indirect. So this is a supplier of card games that would go on the shelves in Target for customers to buy. That's sort of the first part. But the second part is there have been exclusive collaborations between Exploding Kittens and Target in the past. So games that the company makes that can only be purchased at Target, which would suggest a closer than your typical even direct supplier relationship. Now, the funny thing is, and I'm going to have you translate this for me. So this is in corporate speak. This is in buy-side speak. So I'll give you a chance to think about it, and then you can try to put it into common language for us. Target spokesperson said, quote, "We have maintained open and transparent conversations with our vendor partners." So we heard what Exploding Kittens said, and now we've heard Target's official line. Any translation into what that actually means in real life?
So, obviously without knowing fully the meaning of what Target said, but being able to apply that to situations where I've been in automotive, that basically means we're telling you what is happening. We're telling you, like, it's essentially, it's a one-way communication of this is what's happening. You will be, we require you to do these additional things because we're not taking on board the inventory. And there's not a two-way dialogue about that. It's this is what's happening. We've been open. We told you the situation. We told you why we need to do this, but you don't have any say in this. This is what we're doing.
Yeah. Now, are you surprised at all? And there were 3 different suppliers that were named in the article that you and I both read, but are you surprised at all, not only that these suppliers are pushing back, but that they're doing so publicly through quotes from the C-level at their organization in the media?
I mean, that's unusual, but they're either doing it because they have a tremendous amount of leverage. So they're in a situation where it's not like they can be swapped out for another supplier, or they're doing it because they're at their wit's end. They've tried everything else. Communication's not getting through. They're not getting any responses. They're not feeling like they've been heard. And therefore, this is their last resort. But as a last resort, I mean, that's a pretty dangerous game because, it's going to be, no doubt, if that's the case, a long time before some of these larger organizations will want to work with a partner again. I say a partner, a supplier again, that goes to the press when they have challenges. But if they're not being felt like they're being heard, then there's not really anywhere else for them to go.
Yeah. Now, we had also talked about the fact that at least the 3 examples in this article are all direct or merchandise suppliers. And again, we're just guessing, but if this is what we're hearing from suppliers on the direct side, which contributes directly to these retailers' top lines, can we extend that at all to what we might anticipate is happening with indirect suppliers that are less recognizable and a little bit further from the customer?
Possibly. I mean, in the direct space, those materials are they have the more direct impact on the bottom line, a quicker impact on the bottom line.
Right.
But what happens in the direct material space is that you've got things that are engineered into a product, or you have household brands that those retailers, that the customers demand those brands. So there's a lot of leverage in those. There's a lot of switching costs, and it's hard to get out. And sometimes you've created yourself monopoly situations. That doesn't stop a buyer. And again, I did this in the automotive world 20 years ago, going to your supply base and saying, I'm going to take a blanket 5% cost reduction. And if you don't agree to that, then you're not a true partner of mine, which ultimately is how some of these things go. Now, in the indirect space, it again depends on, I would say, the leverage that you have, and it's a little bit more nuanced because of the different ranges of products. Some things it's tough. Your electricity supplier, you're not going to go and have a backwards and forwards over pricing and demand and supply or anything like that. But I've been in situations where I've been responsible for a contract that outsourced HR services for 7 years for a company that only believed they were going to grow, and then the recession hit, and you go back to your provider, and the provider is, well, the contract's the contract. And so, you may think that you can bully me around in terms of trying to renegotiate the contract, but I'm going to stick behind the contract. And again, that's because in that instance, that supplier had all the leverage in the relationship. So, I mean, that's really where it lies. It's relationships and leverage that are going to determine who does what to whom, and who tries to do what to whom, as a result of all these challenges.
Now, to your point about contracts, it's interesting because we do talk relationships and we hopefully work through relationships. But at the end of the day, in reality, everyone is reliant on that contract. I do not know, but I have to think that a lot of the things that are becoming points of contention between retailers and suppliers were specified in contracts. Does this raise concern that even though things are in writing, we can't necessarily enforce them into being?
I would question whether they are in writing or not, in contracts or not, because, in some cases, those contracts will try and be as loose as possible around no actual numbers. What are you actually committing to? In the direct side, you may commit to 100% of volume or 50% of volume without saying what your volume is going to be. And you can give forecasts around what that volume is, but those forecasts aren't contractual. So when it comes to actually the order, the PO that has a volume on it, there's nothing until that PO that is ever committed to what the volume is. And it's really just, well, we think it's going to be this, we think it's going to be that. So I think in some cases you've probably got that, which is then leading to this, well, you intimated the volume would be whatever, and the volume is significantly lower. Well, there's nothing in the contract. Yeah, but you told us, we've amortized our fixed costs over this volume because that's what you suggested. And that's probably where some of the back and forwards is coming from.
Yeah. Now, we sort of started with this issue happening because retailers were trying to protect their customer experience, and they're sort of losing their supplier experience and partnerships as a result of the approach that they're taking. But I know you actually have some interesting, and I would say entertaining thoughts about how this might actually be affecting the customer experience, even though companies don't realize it. Where do you see the connection between these two things?
Yeah, it's interesting. As we said right at the beginning, everything is now a supply chain problem. We have an example where I don't know, in May timeframe, we bought an interior door for our house, and you place the order, and I guess there's a shortage of doors, interior doors, and who knew, when the kids decided to put a hole through one of the bathroom doors. And so we placed the order. We're told that the order is going to be, I think it was early July, so about 6-week lead time through a national retailer to just get a door. And then, of course, they delay it to a time when we're out of the country for a significant period of time, and then tell us that it's our problem, that we're not going to be around in 5 days to pick it up because, we're out of the country, even though it was them that delayed it. So there's this big disconnect, which then creates lots of stress, calling from overseas. And it took us probably, 3 or 4 hours just to get somebody to say, okay, we'll hold on to this store for you until the day you get back from your trip, but don't be late. And so now I've got a negative opinion of my experience with this brand, over something that was probably out of their control, but the way that they managed it is actually what's creating a negative customer experience. I think that people are empathetic generally to the fact that there's delays in supply chain, especially those of us in supply chain.
Yes.
But it's how you manage that as the retailer in this case that actually goes down to what my opinion of the retailer, because the way they handled the situation.
Well, and it is interesting because over the last couple of years, everyone and their mother is now an expert in supply chain. But I think with that, gradually over time has come a level of understanding and sophistication that we're no longer at the point where any retailer or provider can just wave their hands and say, well, supply chain, right? Now people are starting to understand, okay, there are retail points, there are distribution centers. We hear things about Long Beach, California, so we understand there's shipping containers on ocean-faring vessels. I do think we may be coming to the end of the window where simply invoking supply chain crisis is going to apologize for every poor experience.
Yeah, I think people will try it for as long as they can get away with it. We've traveled a lot over this past month, and all these hotels and airlines and airports, they've all complained about supply chain issues for reasons why they can't do things. But, they're still happy to oversell their flights and, try and work on the revenue side to maximize the revenue while cutting down on the cost side and blaming supply chain issues as a result of that, which I think is causing big issues from my customer experience perspective. But something that was also interesting that I noticed in England when I was there for a few weeks is that now the company's ability to hire is now in some cases being connected to supply chain. So I saw a couple of times where the employee supply chain was the reason why something couldn't happen. So it wasn't because they couldn't hire people or because they didn't pay enough wages to hire somebody for the positions they needed to fill. It was now a supply chain issue, but relating to the supply chain of people. So, I didn't know that people were part of it's interesting. We talk from a risk management perspective all the time about supply chains in service businesses. But now that's making its way out into, the excuses for why things aren't available is this people supply chain.
So let's see if we can attempt to brainstorm some potential solutions. I look at every sort of bad news story as an opportunity for all the rest of us to say, what would I do if I were in this position, or what would I not do, and potentially learn from the choices of others. If you're in procurement in a retailer that finds itself, again, net profit margin down over 50% year over year, $15 billion worth of inventory that you wish you didn't have, where do you even start to address this problem? What's within your control?
Yeah, I think there's always short-term and long-term solutions. Short-term is about the situation now, and long-term often gets overlooked, which is, how can we stop this from happening or protect ourselves against this happening in the future? From a short-term perspective, when you have issues like this, in this instance that we're talking about today, it's actually oversupply. You have to work really, really closely with your suppliers. It's communication is so important. The why you're trying to take the decisions, what are the outcomes you're trying to drive, what's your line of thinking, what does the future look like, or what are the data points that are informing your view of the future? Because if you're managing this collaboratively, your suppliers are going to be in a much better position to try and do everything that they can do to help. And they're willing to invest in you if they think it's a short-term, like there's going to be a short-term investment that I'm going to hold on to this stock, for example, because I know that in 6 months or 9 months or when something turns around, the net impact of me doing that is going to be something that's good for me because these other reasons. When you're facing shortages on the other hand, because right now we've got this glut here, we've got shortages over there, it's how can you help your supplier secure subcomponents, or basically put yourself at their mercy to help them support and service you. And doing that is what creates those bonds and those relationships versus just writing a letter to your suppliers and saying, that's the thing that I hated the most in automotive that we would do. Writing a letter to suppliers saying, dear supplier, we're going to take 5% down from you, or this is a situation that we're going to force you to hold on to your inventory, or whatever it is. yours in partnership, Mr. or Mrs. CPO. And we do that, or VP of supply chain, or whoever it came from. And we do that all the time. And then think that when things start to turn around, that these suppliers are going to be our friends again.
Yeah.
And typically it's all through, because of this notion of leverage. And we've got this, it's like I think one of the worst things to come out of the professionalization of procurement is this focus on leverage. When you think of the Kralchik matrix and leverage suppliers, this idea that we'll just use our power to get whatever we want. We've got to get away from that in the short term and the long term, but the short term especially, to have these to be an open book. Long term, it's more around risk management, having alternative sources of supply, having more flexibility, building optionality in contracts. There's a lot of structure you need to set up to enable all those kind of things at scale. But I'm always reminded of what a chief risk officer told me a good number of years, is that, whoever bears the risk essentially is the one that wins financially. There is a cost for bearing risk. And as large company buyers, we like to push as much risk as possible onto our supply base. So you should expect to pay for that.
Well, and it is interesting because we're able to look at the set of circumstances that have played themselves out and say, okay, this wasn't a great idea. That's not a good look. Maybe we understand why they did this in the beginning, but it certainly didn't play out. Retailers have ended up with all this inventory and not enough cash flow. But we will never know. Let's say one of the other alternatives was to sort of roll the dice and assume that supply chain disruptions were not going to be as bad as we were potentially projecting, and risk that there would be things on shelves. We're never going to know in that alternate universe, how would that have actually worked out? And that's sort of the difficult thing about the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it's very hard to scenario plan right now, because there's so many different possibilities and it's hard to game out every potential. So you can't build risk mitigation plans for every single eventuality, but you can look at what's the greatest points of failure. Where are the places where the risk is the highest and the impact, the severity is the highest, and at least understand those points and connections within your supply chain, so you can plan mitigations around those. And from all the teaching and education and things that we do around that, we find that organizations generally don't take that in procurement as seriously as they should do. And it comes to the fore when there's events that are happening, like events that's happened over the last couple of years. It's going to be fascinating to me to see when whatever normal looks like becomes normal, whether we forget everything again, or whether this has been such a big shock to the system that it actually changes the way that we think about our suppliers and about risk management and about the value proposition of procurement.
Yeah. Well, and what I wonder too, and I'm going to date myself by sharing this, but I remember when I was in college watching the Jerry Springer show, and there would always be some horrible fight between friends or family members. Invariably, someone would throw a chair. I don't know where that milk always came from that people were throwing, but I used to wonder, what's the ride home in the car like? Assuming they came to the studio together and are leaving the studio together. And I wonder that a little bit about these relationships between these retailers and especially the specific suppliers that have spoken out publicly about the conditions that they're being forced to handle. Would your gut be that these specific supply relationships can be saved? Or do you think these suppliers are just assuming that by speaking out, they're trying to cover the risk they've already taken on and that it's over anyway?
I would say, a couple of things. One is, because it depends on the way in which an organization worked with a supplier to help overcome some of these problems. Was the buyer an advocate of you, or was he a bully to you? The other thing is, when all the dust is settled, one of the biggest determinants of future relationships is, were those actions that buyer, that client took based on truth or based on trying to take advantage of a situation? And because I've been in negotiations where, as a service provider in a large organization, a client has come to the table asking for huge cost reductions based on, financial struggles. And then the financial results get published at the end of the quarter, and you see there's really no such thing. And so you think, well, was that really based on truth? That damages the relationship forever, frankly. But if you see that that everyone's trying to chip in, and maybe the mode that they did it wasn't the best mode of communication, but it's a real problem that is trying to create an ecosystem that strengthens all its components coming out of it, then you can kind of say, okay, it was hard, but it was necessary, and maybe wish they'd have done it a little bit better in communication, but I can see what they were trying to do, and I'm going to benefit from that coming out of it. It differs from company to company, but that's what I would say in terms of whether a relationship can be saved or not.
Now, here's the harsh reality. Do consumers really care if these retailers are bad to their suppliers? So is there actually anything at risk? We talk about what procurement should do, the type of relationships we want companies to have with their suppliers. But does the consumer actually care to the point where it creates a disincentive for these companies to behave badly?
I mean, there's reputational risk for sure. As you're looking at all kinds of different risk factors when you're building a third-party risk management program, you're going to look at reputational risk as one of those components for you to do the right thing. I guess it depends on the relationship you have with your customers. If your relationship with your customers is based on being good for the world, then if you're seen as not doing that and not upholding to that value, then it's probably going to impact your customers. If your value proposition, to the market is, I'm going to be the cheapest, then they probably don't care how you were able to provide those things on the shelves or the services or whatever it is at that lowest price, because all you really care about is the price.
Yeah. Well, and it is interesting looking at this in the macro trend of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance-based initiatives, because especially B2C companies like retailers have made a concerted push over the last few years to connect with local communities, support small business, increase the diversity of their supply base, and have really put on a very strong promotional front about that so that consumers would know. So part of those brand value propositions are in fact based on at least a perception that these companies care about the world, that they care about communities, that they care about people, that they care about workforce. And so that does sort of raise the bar, even if it just creates sort of an elevated concern around controlling the message of how this gets out to the consumer base. We caught this article going through, but I don't know if the typical consumer would catch it. And yet these things always have a way. Once that mindset shift takes place, once people revert to the old dance and way of handling things, I have a feeling it sort of leaks out into other choices and will eventually become apparent.
Yeah, I think that, practices in one area of a business probably reflect a culture across multiple areas of the business that will show themselves, in different ways that I'm not smart enough to understand or project how, but there's a culture that exists to do things in a certain way, but that might be in a way the consumer expects because they only care about low prices. As an example, having the right things on the shelves at the right price at the right time. My experience has been, does the culture of a company see every single stakeholder as being a potential customer or not? So if you look at all your suppliers and see every single one of your suppliers as a potential future customer, then you're going to treat those suppliers differently than if you don't take that view. Because I've worked as a consultant with organizations who do take that approach. And so their approach to procurement was very different. And this is a huge global organization with a very well-known brand. They see every stakeholder as being a potential customer or an actual customer. They approach their supply base in a very different way than those that don't necessarily think like that.
Yeah. And to that point about culture being pervasive, even though it might be different teams in an organization, I have to think it's an incredible challenge to, on the one hand, try to create a positive, rewarding, frictionless experience for your consumer base, while, with the other hand behind your back, you're sort of bopping a supplier over the head and forcing them to help you deal with these inventory and cash flow issues. those two experiential ends of the supply chain, it does feel like they meet in culture.
Yeah, I think that what you find, and I found this in automotive again, is some of those directives, they are led from the very, very top of an organization, because at the very top of the organization, they're looking at, the dollars and the cents and figuring out how do we overcome these problems that we see in a way that is going to maintain shareholder value. That is pushed down in terms of actions. The folks who are undertaking the actions to make that, to operationalize that direction, are probably caught in this balance between, making sure that they're portraying the message and the strategy of the business, while recognizing that sometimes they're asking for extraordinary things from their partners.
Yeah.
And so the way that they do that is the way that suppliers will come out of that experience, the whole experience. Are they going to come up with that thinking, look, I know this is from above, don't really agree with it. I know you're trying to help, you're trying to protect me from the system. I'll try and do that, and we'll figure out how we can collaborate together, versus are you being the bully who is saying, this is a directive, I'm going to hide behind this, and I'm just going to send email after email demanding that you do what this says, because that's how I'm measured in enforcement. It's on us as procurement professionals to decide how we're going to manage that, even if the requests don't seem fair in their nature.
Now, we have quotes from 3 suppliers in this article, but we know that large retailers have many, many, many more suppliers than that. If instead of being managing director at Art of Procurement, you were, say, the president and CEO of Exploding Puppies, that made card games and board games, what advice would you take? So how would seeing this article, how might hearing this conversation affect the way that you deal with retailers in protecting your business? Any advice for other suppliers?
I'd probably change my brand from Exploding Puppies. But it depends on how important a client, most likely this isn't a client by client issue. You're going to get it from across the industry. So as an industry, you're going to recognize, these are kind of hard times for my industry. How can I best support my clients get through this time in a way that doesn't negatively impact my business, to the extent where I can no longer support and provide whatever it is I'm servicing to my clients. So you've got to recognize that this is not just a problem that is one supplier that has, it's going to go across the board. At that point, you're kind of deciding from a portfolio perspective, which of the clients strategically do I want to align myself most closely with because of where the future of my business is going? And is their reactions and the way that they're handling this a determinant in where I believe that should be? Because I think it's fair to say, even people who say this isn't true, as a business owner, you invest the time, you go above and beyond the call of duty with those clients who you have a really strong relationship and believe would return the favor, and those that you want to invest in. So that's really where you're looking, is where is that? Now, I know from automotive, there'll be times when, because in automotive, there are so few end customers. In the US, you had the big 3. Well, if you're in the Midwest, if you're a Midwest provider of automotive plastic moldings, you've got 3 suppliers, 3 ultimate suppliers to supply to. So, and all 3 of those have probably got faced with the same issues at the same time. If you make enemies of one, then that's a third of your potential total market gone. And so sometimes you just got to take it. And that's one of the things that I really struggle with, and one of the motivators for starting Art of Procurement was to get procurement out of that way of thinking. When you're a provider, that's kind of the reality of the situation. If you're in an industry where you have taken yourself down a path where you only have 2 or 3 or 4 potential clients.
Now, what lessons should the rest of us take from this? To some extent, we're all dealing with the same challenging circumstances. We have varying options and alternatives available to us. But what are sort of the general takeaways from thinking about this story and watching the impact that it's having throughout the supply ecosystem?
Yeah, I would say from a buyer perspective, sometimes you can't change the fact that your company needs to make hard decisions and do things that you may believe are out of beyond what is reasonable things to ask from your suppliers. What you are as a professional is in control of how you manage that situation. And so the way that you manage it, the empathy you show, the communication, kind of being as open book as possible, can change the outcome. It's not going to change how difficult it is on a supplier, but it may change them from saying, well, no way, and getting into a fight, where people start talking about contracts and then start talking to the press, versus how do we work this out? I can't really do that. I can do this. Maybe there's something you can do over here. If you can reduce my cost to serve you over there a little bit, that gives me a little bit more wiggle room. How can we be collaborative to solve the problem? I think that's the first thing. And the second thing, that I'd always say is around risk management and optionality, and just, how are we thinking long term around what our points of failure of having multiple sources, and not creating monopolies where ultimately the supplier actually has the leverage because you've got no one else you can buy from.
Yeah. It's interesting because you've mentioned empathy a couple of times today. And I happen to know, this is sort of like time travel. By the time people are watching and hearing this interview, the episode of Dial P that was previously released is about empathy, because I do think we're in very difficult times. I think you're spot on with your points about fatigue. We're so focused on supply chain resilience, but the human resilience, I think, is starting to fall off. Our tolerance for uncertainty, we're exhausted. And it seems like so many of these problems, the longer they go on, the fewer solutions we actually have. And yet you're also right that as a business owner, you have to make tough decisions sometimes. Knowing that I'm totally catching you off guard with this, any final thoughts that you want to share on this topic of empathy? Because I do think it's hard in ordinary times, but it's that much harder given where we actually are today.
Yeah, look, people buy from people. We've all got this cloak of a corporation behind us, of a corporation of one or a corporation of a million, but we're still just individuals trying to transact and do business with each other, and make our days as simple as possible, in service of reaching all of our goals and achieving our goals. You also have no idea what any one person is dealing with at the time when you're engaging with them. So empathy, I think, is always really important. You think about how, if you're a supplier, how do you react if you get an email that's really threatening, demanding, and bullying, versus getting an email or a phone call from your buyer which explains the situation, talks about the challenges, and offers up, like, how can we figure out, how we get through this together? And that just changes the conversation in my mind, and shows that, hey, we're working together individual to individual, rather than I'm going to hide behind this big company that I am and a directive that they've sent out, because, it's not my problem.
Yeah. Now, to that point, I feel like I would be messing up what people would ask if I didn't bring this conversation full circle and ask, did you get the interior door yet?
We'll see. By the time this goes out, it will be clear. They gave me until today to pick it up, as an extension to my, the 5 days or something that we're supposed to have. Now, I'm kind of 50-50 whether it's going to be there when I turn up. So we shall see. To be continued.
And to that point, bonus credit for being here with me recording this interview, as opposed to being at the retailer picking up your door. So especially if you get there and the door is gone, I feel like you at least get extra credit and bonus points for making the choice to be here.
I know who to blame.
Well, fortunately, I live too far away to help, and you really don't want me installing doors. So hopefully it's there when you get to the store to pick it up. Phil, this was fun, I think, informative, hopefully educational for people. If people watching this interview later have questions, including the installation status of your door, or anything really about what procurement can do, how we should be working with our suppliers through these times, and even generally speaking, the role of empathy in relationships in business, what is the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One is that all of these types of topics, we create a lot of content on at Art of Procurement. So anybody, always go there, artofprocurement.com. You're going to find blog posts, podcasts, videos. whole works on a lot of topics related to procurement that can help you. If you'd like to reach out one-on-one, I'm always available on LinkedIn. So send a LinkedIn request over. I will, I read everything and respond as quickly as I can. So that's probably the best way to connect personally.
Awesome. Please do check out Art of Procurement's resources. Please connect with Phil on LinkedIn. And of course, follow Dial P on LinkedIn. Reach out to me if you have comments. I always encourage people, don't just listen. Let this be a two-way discussion. So you can always add comments under any post on any social media platform where you find this. You can direct message me. And please make sure anyone that you think would benefit from this conversation and information gets it. Send it over to them and then let us know, because it's important for me to know which topics and conversations resonate and how we're actually helping everyone handle today's challenges better. So thank you, Philip Ideson, Managing Director at Art of Procurement, for being with me today. Thank you to everybody that's listening and watching later on. I'm your host, Kelly Barner, here on Dial P for Procurement on Supply Chain Now. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Dial P for Procurement and for being an active part of the Supply Chain Now community. Please check out all of our shows and events at supplychainnow.com. Make sure you follow Dial P for Procurement on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook to catch all the latest programming details. We'll see you soon for the next episode of Dial P for Procurement.